Hey there, I'm Mark from Spectrum Pulse, and today we finally have from Ghais Guevara, Goyard Ibn Said. This feels like a review that's been long in coming, mostly because Ghais Guevara has been on my radar throughout the early 2020s in the growing school of militant leftist rappers who have the brains and attitude in order to back it up. The JPEG Mafia comparison's kind of reductive, so let's mention it, move on. But he's also had a run of pretty solid guest features among acts I really like. But I've kind of been skeptical about his solo output, where I heard a ton of potential with the pieces largely being there, but maybe more refinement required in the execution. Now, some of that's to be expected. He's considerably younger than many of his peers in the underground, and that translates to a distinctly warped Gen Z 2-on-line sensibility in some of his wordplay and sampling, and that can occasionally land the odd note. And given some of my reticence towards chipmunk voices and sampling, I was waiting for the project that sharpened all those edges. I liked a decent amount of the content on Black Bolshevik, and the more sober and thoughtful There Will Be No Super Slave, but some of the production inconsistencies kind of frustrated me. Even as the more listens I gave it, the more I think I could have gotten over that in 2022 if I wanted to. But we're now over 3 years later. This is one of the more hotly anticipated albums of early 2025 in hip-hop, and once again I'm left in an odd place because this is pretty much exactly what I was hoping for coming out of Ghais Guevara, a more refined and expanded project with a deliberate conceptual framework, easily his most ambitious to date. And yet, while it has kinda grown on me with repeated listens, I'm still not as on board as I would like to be. And I want to start off with that concept and theme. From the perspective of a stage play, he's telling the story of Goyard, a fictional street rapper who sees the rush of success and wealth, with the first half playing for the glorious and very modern hype anthem celebrating the success and come up, only for the second half to see the bottom fall out, exploring the trauma of the suffering of black people, even those who might see success, then being commodified for the entertainment of white audiences, with the Apple That Scarcely Fell exposing some of that grisly cycle, and then the framing pulled back far enough to capture the full range of the emotion without explicit judgment on whatever they're doing in that scene, be it even violent. Now, initially, I was reminded of a slew of similar metatextual releases about a decade ago in 2014 when trap was taking over, but there's a little more nuance and empathy here. He's not looking down on the art form that generates the bangers so much as the system that will see all the profit, why white audiences then seek it out, and specifically why some black folks play into it, and by the final song after the play framing device ends, he cuts further back into the predominantly white liberal audience who might appreciate the meta commentary, but will still buy into the same system, and then the rappers who are in that game who will choose the bag over any class solidarity if the bullets start flying. Now, none of this is precisely new ground. Highlighting how entertainment is often used as a deflection for black trauma has underscored a lot of trap music if you gave it a proper chance. It's also basically been the grisly through line of Vince Staples' best material, including his phenomenal album last year, Dark Times, which also made use of a similar play performative device and had similar subtextual echoes in the failure of men specifically to express their vulnerability. The most stark on this project being the challenges of machismo and critical acclaim. But you can tell that Ghais Guevara has the language and systemic framing to ask some harder questions, especially of the folks and critics who will engage a layer deeper, but are still participants in that system and not bringing a certain amount of empathy towards a flawed artist. Now, granted, he's doing so with that Rothschild reference at the end of the first verse, you can skip that part, along with a very telling no-name reference, which doesn't exactly help with some of the allegations behind some of his social media backlash that inspired the album art, Socialism of Fools and all that. He knows exactly what he's doing, come on man. But the plea for imperfect empathy and then putting money or blood where one's mouth is when it comes to solidarity, there's resonance there. But this is where we get into execution, and, well, okay. Even if Ghais Guevara is playing a character here, and it might make sense, it feels like a lot of his wild, politically edgy flair is kind of gone, which was doing some heavy lifting in order to overcome shortcomings in the rhyme construction and flow. And while I'd argue he does a pretty convincing imitation of a lot of those acts in modern trap, or those who flex with a little bit more elegance in the mainstream, even if I know it's intentional, some of the clunkier rhymes and flexing is kinda hollow to me. I know the purpose behind it in the construction of the album, it doesn't mean it's gonna stick, especially when his brand of it tends to be a little bit more lethargic and restrained. Also might be part of the point in highlighting one's own diminished artistic soul in playing the part, but across the project it creates the impression of being heavier and longer, especially in the second half. It doesn't help matters that his guest stars bring a little bit more edge and energy to bear, with Yoko McThuggin and Faro playing a little more into the hype on the first act with more menace, and ELUCID and especially McKinley Dixon bringing the harsher edge on the second half, the latter who just utterly steals the show on the Apple That Scarcely Fell, probably my favorite verse on the project. And you know, part of my issue is some of the production, the majority of which was written and produced by him, and strikes frustrating notes for me. I'm not as fazed by dropping the kookier sampling for something that might be considered or framed as more mature, but when you don't love a lot of modern trap or rage production, even before the chipmunk sampling, and Ghais Guevara tends to mix his voice a little deeper, the hooks are not popping off as much as you might hope in order to sell it. For example, the percussion ramps up pretty well on 3400, but the squealing mix and the early Kendrick Lamar impression didn't quite connect for me, or how the grinding, glassy electro of Monta Ellis that never seems to pay off the curdled tension, or how For Life gets suffocated in some of the glossy dance vibe. There are exceptions. I like the freewheeling, semi-ironic summer flair of Leprosy, and the sputtering rumble behind Camera Shy. Even with that sample, I was a little bit surprised it came around on it. And then when we get to the second act, the production gets a lot darker and more textured, like with the haunted, textured patter of Bystander, or the keys and mournful strings of the Apple That Scarcely Fell with no drums, the gracefully symphonic trap of Brandon and Shaitan's Spiderweb, especially as the latter will decompose into clattering noise with some really nice horn touches. But as a whole, I'm gonna say it, I think this is a project I think I respect a lot more than I like, with a really compelling thematic arc, a couple striking moments that are let down by, well, frustrations I've had with Ghais Guevara since the jump. Some of this is just my own taste in production or niggling issues I've had with him as a rapper the entire time in terms of expressive delivery or lyrical construction, all which will probably work for a younger audience who might look past it. And even with that, in order to mask some of it within the album's concept, he's stepping away from the playful flair that gave his previous projects so much vibrancy. You don't have to lose it in making more serious projects. And hell, for as much as this project critiques machismo, the metatext of stereotypical and coded cool or serious, in this case, contributed to less compelling art, even if you're making a deconstruction. So yeah, I call it an example of compelling ideas and intent and kind of middling execution, but also one where I'm gonna be empathetic to the struggle of getting caught up in a bad system where empathy is discouraged, and breaking down structural inequity feels impossible and draining. You feel diminished, especially when you actually have found some success. And while I'm sure off this album, the words of the critic are the last thing Ghais Guevara cares about, you know, he should keep steadfastly pursuing the cause. I'm looking forward to hearing more. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you want to see more, please be sure to like, share, drop comments, subscribe. I know this is probably not going to be received well. Again, I know how certain artists respond to these sorts of reviews. Trust me when I say that I was trying to give this a fair shake. I really wanted to like this a lot. But again, sometimes you bounce off of art and it just doesn't click, even if you can respect what it's trying to do. That feels like really the case with this. Beyond that, though, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if y'all want to get involved and help and support the channel, like, again, link to my Patreon and YouTube memberships over there, you can get albums onto my schedule, or hell, just yell at me more directly on my Discord. Looking forward to hearing it. Again, no obligation, tough times, I understand. The option is available. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.